Well, howdy there, internet people. It's Bo. That's not my intro. Hey, y'all. Welcome back to Snark Notes. It's been a hot minute, and I'm sorry. I'm gonna blame it on coronavirus. It just, killed all of my motivation. With everything going on right now, government goon squads in the streets, armed patriot militias, black people found hanging in trees throughout June, and the panic/pandemic buying of guns and ammo, I think we need to take a critical look at American gun culture. To do that, we're going to be doing a review of Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. I can already feel the conservatives getting mad at me. Sorry, Dad. Dunbar-Ortiz makes a lot of good connections that mainstream voices just don't have the framework to analyze. From her research, we can clearly see that American gun culture is not a new thing, and it's not solely the product of the NRA and its propaganda. More like propaganda, am I right? No, the fetish for guns in this country goes back much farther than the so-called moral majority or the religious right movements of the 1970s and 80s. So let's start at the beginning. Did you know that there were laws on the books in the mid-1600s that required colonists to be armed? Because I didn't. In Virginia, for example, it was illegal for any man to travel unless he was well armed. In 1658, every settler home in Virginia had to own a functioning firearm. Later, the colonial government provided loans for those who could not afford to buy a weapon. Other New England colonies had similar statutes. Dunbar-Ortiz cites the 1632 requirement that each person have a functioning firearm, plus 2 pounds of gunpowder and 10 pounds of bullets. She goes on to explain, households were fined for missing or defective arms and ammunition. No man was to appear at a public meeting unarmed. All of this must have been for hunting, right? It was so settlers could protect themselves from Indigenous people. That little thing about how the U.S. was founded on the stolen land? Well, white settlers had to fight to gain control of that land, to dominate it and the people who already lived on it. And they basically lived in fear of Indigenous fighters attacking their settlements, so they remained armed at all times. This was a tactic of savage war. Military historian John Grenier explains it as a combination of unlimited war and irregular war, and a military tradition that accepted, legitimized, and encouraged attacks upon and the destruction of non-combatants, villages, and agricultural resources in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of conquest. To the settler colonialists, it didn't matter if Indigenous people would actually carry out attacks to win back the land that was stolen from them. The settler colonialists shot and burned and pillaged first and asked questions. Well, never. It's important to note, too, that the militias that formed around protecting these settlements were composed of landed settlers. See, one of the largest sources of colonial wealth was land speculation. Dunbar-Ortiz points out that the wealthiest colonists were all speculators. So to make more money, they had to acquire and sell off more land. This principle also applied to slavery because enslavers needed more and more land for planting as they continued to exhaust the soil with monocropping. Also because their drive to increase yearly profits required more land to grow larger harvests. But these settler colonialists couldn't just expand any direction they wanted because the Indigenous people who already inhabited that land were in their way. So they destroyed food supplies, whether fields, managed forests, or livestock, razed villages, and imprisoned or murdered unarmed Indigenous people, particularly women, children, and elders. In fact, scalp hunting became popular among settler colonialist militiamen. Dunbar-Ortiz notes that colonial authorities incentivized it as a recruitment tool for these militias and as a profitable endeavor. She explains, during the Pequot War, Connecticut and Massachusetts colonial governments had offered bounties initially for the heads of murdered Indigenous peoples, and later for only their scalps, which were more portable in large numbers. All of this went on throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. This warfare against Indigenous people directly informed the installation of the Second Amendment, which, as a quick refresher, reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed." If we analyze that through the lens of colonization and the eradication of Indigenous people and their settlements, which we should because, look, That's inextricable from the goals of colonial American militias. We see a deeply sinister element of the Second Amendment. It wasn't intended as a means for people to protect themselves from a tyrannical state, but from any forces that would impede the state's growth. The genocide of Indigenous people isn't the only part of America's bloody history that has shaped our gun culture. We need to also discuss masculinity, racism, and slavery. Yeehaw, fellas! Daniel Boone is perhaps one of the most famous American frontiersmen. He forged his way through the Appalachian Mountains, a courageous man working tirelessly for a good life for his family. He was a great hunter, a great friend to the Indians, and a great inspiration for the wandering, industrious American man. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong guy. Daniel Boone made a career of selling land that wasn't his. Drawing from John Bakeless's work, Dunbar-Ortiz explains that Boone crossed into sovereign native land so as to covertly survey it and sell it to white settlers, who would then form themselves into militias to murder the families who had been living there for generations, thus perpetuating the cycle of colonialism and genocide, Dunbar-Ortiz adds, regarding Boone's hunting career, it was purely commercial. He killed animals not for food, but to sell their pelts for profit. Boone made a modest living as a market hunter. Ah, what a brave man, foraying into and claiming land that wasn't his to turn a profit, all the while endangering Indigenous people. In that way, Boone is definitely an inspiration. He is a symbol for the American businessman, disrespecting and depleting natural resources and human beings' lives for the sake of personal enrichment. That's manifest destiny, folks. Another larger-than-life figure that comes to mind when we think of the American hunter is Teddy Roosevelt, the eugenicist. And he had a huge fetish for the hunt. Here's something he wrote.
No form of labor is harder than the chase, nor none so excellent as a training school for war. A race of peaceful, unwarlike farmers would have been helpless before such foes as the Red Indians.
Roosevelt hunted for sport, for trophies, and, as Dunbar-Ortiz puts it, distinguished himself from those game hunters who hunt and kill animals for profit or to eat. He embraced the Boone myth, as men killed only to test and prove their manhood. Woof. Not only was he a classist, or a white supremacist who believed Indigenous peoples were so inferior that they would go extinct, he was a huge perpetrator of American imperialism. More on that in a minute. So, both Boone and TR have greatly impacted the archetype of gun-owning American men. The mythologizing of Daniel Boone teaches men to be fearless, to push the boundaries, in order to provide for your family, because that's the ultimate goal. It doesn't matter if you're encroaching upon or causing material harm to Indigenous people along the way, because, they don't matter. As for Teddy, he's kind of like the standard for American masculinity. Rugged, tough guy who takes no shit, won't hesitate to shoot a bear or whatever, all the while presenting himself with the utmost dignity and class and civility. He preached and practiced the idea that the hunt, the kill, is the ultimate way to prove one's worth as a man. He stood his ground even in the face of war. He was a composed but deadly force to reckon with. That's a powerful image, and that's still how 2A'ers today see themselves. So, if you didn't already know, American policing originated from slave patrols. Yeah. Since chattel slavery wasn't common in Europe, but was developed specifically for New World colonization and profiteering, settlers got to write their own rules for enforcing slavery. Dunbar-Ortiz writes, the 1661 and 1688 slave codes of the British Caribbean colony of Barbados extended the task of controlling enslaved Africans from overseers and slavers to all white settlers, in effect shifting private responsibility to the public. This carried over into the American colonies, where states like South Carolina and Virginia utilized already existing volunteer militias, the ones from earlier, and armed settlers as slave patrols. North Carolina, meanwhile, didn't pull from established militias, but established what they called searchers, who were authorized by courts and exempt from militia duty as well as from jury duty and taxation. These men were eventually paid salaries by the state for patrolling enslaved people. Dunbar-Ortiz cites historian Sally Haddon, who explains in her book Slave Patrols that all white men, regardless of class, were required to serve in militias and slave patrols, but the commanders of the patrols were property owners and slavers. Impoverished whites were not trusted because they would not be able to compensate enslavers if their enslaved persons were injured or killed during capture. This dynamic only became more violent over time, especially during and after the Civil War, which provided Southern men with military training that they then used to take their extreme hatred and resentment out on free black people. In fact, during the Reconstruction era, elite white Southerners formed volunteer militias under the guise of private rifle clubs. This allowed thousands of Confederate combat veterans, along with former Confederate guerrillas, to mobilize quickly. One such man was Nathan Bedford Forrest, founder of the Ku Klux Klan. He served as Confederate cavalry officer in the Civil War, and he also led a brutal massacre of black Union soldiers in 1864. He was pardoned, because of course he was, by President Andrew Johnson. And Forrest isn't an anomaly here. First, he's representative of the anger of the Southern white ruling class, whose ability to profit from the forced free labor of enslaved people was obviously greatly impacted by the end of slavery. Second, Forrest, like many other angry and racist white Southerners, had easy access to guns and military knowledge, which they used to terrorize black people. Third, these anti-black militias were allowed to commit terrorist acts with impunity. Nothing was done to curtail racist violence because Southern governments, and Northern ones, let's be honest, and the power structures that maintained them, cops, were built upon the subjugation of black people. Think about that the next time you hear a country song or something about Southerners taking pride in their guns. 'Cause what are white men down here afraid of? The government? Nuh-uh. They're either lying to themselves or they're lying to you. The government has historically sided with them and has never adequately dealt with racist violence. Aw, hey, look! Another facet of colonialism. So this iteration of the archetype of the American man is a synthesis of the hunter and the slave patroller types. Rangers developed out of the image of the pioneer who needed to protect himself and his family or community from indigenous resistance fighters as settlers expanded into the present-day Midwest and Deep South, particularly Florida and Texas. Dunbar-Ortiz writes, Richard Slotkin describes a mystique that developed around the persona of the ranger, involving a certain identification with the native enemy, marking the settler as the original American rather than European. By dressing and fighting as Indians, the ranger appropriated the savage's power and American nativity for himself and turned it against both savage and redcoat. This mystique became a part of popular culture, as well as military culture. Rangers are the ones who cleared the frontier, who did James Monroe's and Andrew Jackson's bidding against the Muskogee and the Seminoles in Georgia and Florida. They did enslavers' bidding in Texas, seizing the land from indigenous people first and foremost, and from Mexico second, so that enslavers could expand their plantations there. Definitely be discussing that in a future video, so stay tuned. Rangers were codified in U.S. militia culture in the form of Texas Rangers, the ones who cleared the land and offered protection for enslavers. Later, Texas Rangers worked closely with the U.S. military, particularly during the Mexican-American War. As seasoned counterinsurgents, they guided U.S. Army forces deep into Mexico, taking part in the siege of Veracruz and, with the U.S. Marine Corps, the occupation of Mexico City, until the Mexican government, under brutal occupation, signed a dubious treaty transferring the northern half of Mexico to the United States. Ranger militias were directly responsible for the implementation of Manifest Destiny, slaughtering indigenous people and their resources, like bison, so that the American empire could keep expanding, wringing profit from the land and the enslaved people who were forced to work it. It wasn't just limited to the contiguous United States. Teddy Roosevelt, that guy, his Rangers in the so-called Spanish-American War, and later his presidency and gunboat diplomacy all factor in here too. All of these tactics were used to expand American control over modes of production and transportation of goods around the world, so that capitalists here could increase their profits and further subjugate non-white people across the world. Back in America, once settlers gained control of the West, the Ranger type morphed into, or perhaps just fused with, the outlaw type. American culture has this romanticized vision of badass outlaws, right? Leather-clad Robin Hoods on horseback, robbing banks and giving the spoils to the poor. That's just blatantly false. So many of the Wild West outlaws we've idolized were former Confederates, particularly Jesse James and the rest of the James Younger gang. Many of these outlaw men, and women in the case of Belle Starr, came from slave-owning families and had explicitly worked to preserve the institution of slavery. Some of them had served the Confederacy under William Quantrill, who terrorized abolitionists in Missouri before the Civil War, and led the Lawrence, Kansas Massacre of 1863. Not all of America's outlaw heroes were former Confederate guerrillas. Billy the Kid wasn't, but he did work as a gunman during the range wars of the latter half of the 19th century. He protected his employer's property, his land and his capital, with a gun. That's a pretty common theme in all of this, isn't it? Men with guns volunteering or being hired to protect property. Anyway, it's pretty easy to see just how enmeshed Wild West romanticism is in American gun culture. Gunslinging tough guys. Just guys being dudes. It's all American. I know my grandfather watches old westerns religiously, and my dad, who was raised on them, does too to a lesser extent. It deeply informs their views on masculinity and gun ownership, as does the hunter archetype. And that experience is in no way limited to just them. I mean, look at the Bundy Ranch standoff back in 2014, and how conservatives and libertarians are wild about that. These down-home farmers protecting their land against the encroaching federal government, even though the land the Bundys were grazing their cattle on was federally protected. The hunter, the patroller, the ranger, and the outlaw all deeply inform the archetype of the American man. These images have been immortalized in American culture in our tall tales, our written stories, our modern media, and our history books. Gun rights activists pull greatly from all of these identities. They use them to shape ideas about the meaning of masculinity, toughness, and cowardice, about the importance of protecting yourself, your family, and your property from intruding forces, and about the ultimate freedom of self-reliance. All the figures that feature in gun lore, Daniel Boone, Teddy Roosevelt, the Texas Rangers, Jesse James, are powerful because of their guns and their perceived propensity to use them without hesitation. Our culture celebrates them because they don't back down in the face of fear or tyranny. It doesn't matter if that notion is true in real life. That's how they've been immortalized in popular memory. And because we live in a deeply white supremacist society, one that actively hides how militias have been used to slaughter the original inhabitants of this country and to protect the interests of wealthy landowners and enslavers, it's so easy to romanticize all of these self-reliant gunslingers. It's so easy for our culture to persuade us that these militias were just using their guns to protect themselves and their families. It's so easy for right-wingers to capitalize on those romanticized notions about gun ownership as tradition and moral duty without having to think critically about just how bloody America's devotion to guns has always been. Gun legislation has been used to protect whiteness, property, and capital from the very beginning of the colonization of this country, back when colonial governments required every man to carry. And so many Americans, particularly the white ones, are blind to that. So, the first time I heard of this book was on Parkland activist David Hogg's Twitter, and that was a thought I kept coming back to when I was reading the book, because it strikes me as highly myopic to engage with this text and still be calling for liberal gun control measures. As I said in the beginning of this video, American gun fetishism didn't start in the 70s and 80s. It's etched into the core of this country. This entire state was founded on gun violence, from the massacre of Indigenous people to the brutal enslavement of Africans and their descendants to the empire-building wars, mostly waged against Black and brown people, across the world. That is a problem that merely banning ARs and or making a national gun registry will not even begin to address. Legislation cannot disentangle American gun culture from American nationalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. And yeah, I don't really care how many good gun owners there are out there. You may have a gun, and you may not be a racist. You may even be a leftist with a gun who's anti-racist. But that doesn't really change the roots of America's love for guns. And I think leftists especially need to be aware of. Look, I'm from the South. I grew up around people who kept guns for hunting, a huge part of my family, as well as people who have built their identity around gun ownership. Again, a huge part of my family. Dunbar-Ortiz points out in the text that the modern NRA, gun manufacturers, and lobbying groups have all taken advantage of that dynamic. they didn't start American gun worship. They've profited from it. And, I'd argue, they've helped sustain the modern Republican Party as a hegemonic force, tying gun ownership with conservatism and traditionalism. But honestly, that was a super easy thing for them to do, because racism and white supremacist violence are very traditional for America. I was actually going to do a whole section about how America has always been a proto-fascist or a fascist-adjacent state, since, we've always done genocides and race-based slavery and eugenics, all for the sake of capital. But this video is long enough already, so I'm going to keep this section short and sweet for now. It's easy to be a white supremacist in America. Given that whole legacy of genocide, slavery, racism, patriarchy, etc. The government still doesn't consider the fucking KKK a terrorist organization. So it's easy to be a white supremacist, and it's also easy to get guns. But also, as we discussed briefly earlier, American policing evolved from slave patrols. And there's so much data about how white supremacists and neo-Nazis have infiltrated law enforcement and the military. Do you really think, then, that if guns were somehow outlawed, that such a gun ban would really apply to armed fascists? 'Cause I sure as shit don't. Yeah, no, police would absolutely not take away a fascist's guns or prosecute them to any extent for owning banned weapons. Instead, they would look past or actively defend fascist narratives, whatever those may be. Look at the shooting of Garrett Foster in Austin, Texas 2 weekends ago. Observers say Foster didn't draw his gun at the man who drove up to the protest barricades, but that man, who is in the U.S. military, shot Foster dead and told police that Foster drew his gun first. And the police ran with that story. Here in my city back in June, I believe, there was a Black Lives Matter demonstration downtown that patriot types and at least one Klansman showed up to. The Klansman was armed, as was another man, and even when they were standing right next to a police officer, that officer later claimed he didn't see any guns on them. The armed men did get fined a few days later, but the fact that the officer initially didn't see them carrying when it's illegal to carry during protests in North Carolina is fucked. But liberals don't really understand this whole dynamic because they don't have any framework for a material or historical analysis of gun ownership and American white supremacy. They haven't drawn the connections between militias, manifest destiny, and the genocide of Indigenous people to clear land for slavery or other business enterprise. And it's not necessarily liberals' fault. Again, the U.S. education system and our media actively conceal these things and shut out the voices of Indigenous and Black activists who do draw those connections. I say this because I was a lib once, and my whiteness served as a shield to keep me from understanding how white supremacy has always affected American gun culture. I thought, too, that since Australia was able to ban guns after their mass shooting in 1996, that America should be able to do the same. But the historical reality here is different. Yes, Australia is also a colonial state, but as Dunbar-Ortiz so critically notes, other British settler colonies never declared the gun a God-given right. Only the founding fathers of the United States did that. And the people of other Anglo-settler colonies did not have economies, governments, and social orders based on the enslavement of other human beings. At least, not for as long as the United States did. Colonialism is still going on, and the former colonial powers, which comprise the Western world, still to this day profit from the subjugation of workers in the global South. Keeping all of this in mind, then, perhaps the biggest flaw in liberals' proposed gun control legislation is that it does absolutely nothing to address white supremacy, to take power away from the police state. Like, do we really want these guys to be the only ones with access to guns?
Back the fuck up! Hey! Oh, shit! I'm back! Our streets!
we all know this by now, but protesters in Portland have been taken into custody for merely wearing gas masks or writing in chalk on the sidewalk. Protesters in Richmond have been preemptively attacked before protests even began. Like, that's a pretty big red flag. And so is the fact that the federal government has sent military, private contractors into cities to shut down free speech and the freedom of assembly. And before anybody whines to me about how those scary Antifas are doing graffiti or breaking windows and shit, save it for someone who cares. You can clean graffiti or replace broken windows or stolen merchandise. You can't bring George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, or the countless others police and white supremacists have murdered. Life is worth more than property. Fascists and white nationalists wouldn't be the one punished for purchasing and owning guns if gun control were to ever pass. It would be Black and Indigenous people of color and leftists, and the punishments would be incredibly stiff, if not outright murderous. Because, again, fascists are friends with cops. Some of them even are cops. And the institution of policing has historically always turned a blind eye to white supremacist violence. So I'll be damned if they're the only ones who get to have guns in this country. Activists, and innocent people unaffiliated with the protests, are already getting seriously injured or murdered by these people, and the cops aren't ever going to do enough to stop it. So yes, American gun culture is absolutely fraught with racism. It was built upon whiteness as a means to slaughter Indigenous people to expand this country and its ability to turn a profit. It was built upon racism and the enforcement of slavery, Jim Crow, and racialized terror. It was built as a narrative to sustain American nationalism within the country and U.S. hegemony internationally. We absolutely need to analyze and recognize all of these things. And we need to understand that gun control will not ameliorate any of them. Arm up, leftists. We have a long fight ahead of us. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate your time and your attention. And if you could like, comment, and share this video, I would be forever grateful. So yeah, I've been working on kind of a long-term project. So I didn't just sit around and do nothing during quarantine, but that's mostly what I did. Based on the book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward Baptist. I'm going through and writing down chapter notes so that I can set up videos, breaking down each chapter so that they're more digestible because it's a really big book. So yeah, if you guys want to keep an eye out for that, go ahead. I'll keep you updated on my Twitter, which is right here. That's how you do things. Thank y'all again for watching. Stay safe. Take care out there. Wear your mask. Wash your hands. If you're protesting, be super careful. All right. See you guys next time.